How would you say those the segregated living, the segregated housing, why is that so detrimental to the Black community?
But Dr. King believed we should all have equal access to affordable housing, public or private, and that we didn't have a fair housing law. So we could go, for example, to buy a house. If you walked into a house, they would tell you that there was no housing available. One of our white friends come right behind and the house was available. And so when the Black would come, they would then tell other whites, Blacks are coming. They would call block busting. So we had to end block busting, we had to end housing segregated by race. All those schemes inherent in the scheme, it was the bankers and the brokers that were controlling the process. So always the bigger law, and the law of closed housing locked us out of access to open housing.
All right, there we just heard Reverend Jackson talking about the importance of equal housing, certainly then, and we can definitely say that some of that still exists today. Joining us now to discuss housing is Chicago activist, Oscar, Golden Globe, and Grammy Award-winning artist Rhymefest Smith. Also, Sonya Jackson, who is founder of Mantra for Good, which is an organization that works to improve the community. Now, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, Chicago lost 181,000 Black residents between the year 2000 and 2010. So right now, we're seeing a lot of people leave the city when almost about 50 years ago we were trying to see a lot of people come to the city to find opportunity. What do you all attribute that to?
I think it's attributed to a number of things. I think high taxes in the state of Illinois. I think there's still a tremendous lack of housing opportunities, even as we see buildings going up all over the city. Some of them are incredibly unaffordable for most people that, would want to live in the city. There's certainly a continued push to, when the projects went away in Chicago, there was a push to put African Americans and people of color, or people who would use low-income housing into the suburbs, and I think that is an ongoing problem, and we have to continue to to fight for what Dr. King was fighting for, and to help to create opportunities for more equal housing.
I also think that there's a perception problem by residents in Chicago that we are powerless, that we don't have political power. There are things that people would like to see in terms of our neighborhood schools, or a school board, or that people have been working on for decades and haven't been able to make happen. Chicago is a city that is made from communities, and when communities aren't able to exercise the power that we believe we have historically, you see people start to leave to go to places where they believe they have power.
Where there's the opportunity.
You know what I mean? Where there's opportunity. So I think, when we look at gentrification, when we look at economic opportunities, and when we look at just being able to elect who we want to see in office, people are starting to feel powerless.
As you look at trends, there's a genesis from which all these things started, and you look at the segregated housing pattern set in place from decades ago, right, which has put our people in a position where we can't find that economic stabilization because of historically we've been put at a place behind everyone else. How has that had an impact on today when we talk about equal housing rights, something that Martin Luther King championed so long ago, and the segregation that is so prevalent in the city of Chicago?
Well, you look at how, the 1968 was 50 years ago, and there have been some changes, but there hasn't been a ton of change. And I think that the way that impacts housing now is because Chicago is responsible for creating some of the most segregated neighborhoods in this country. Chicago is really, unfortunately, the home of segregation, and I think that the challenge is that hasn't changed. You look at things have changed, but the city is still very racially polarized. And
and we must say, as we talk about the issues, the hope is in places like Bronzeville, or places like Woodlawn, where we're starting to see mixed income housing. I just visited the University of Chicago. They have a free exhibit on the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and this is something that's free for people in the neighborhood. I just visited the National Museum of Mexican Art in Pilsen, and you see areas like Pilsen like really showing what diversity is in the city. So there is hope in the city.
No, there absolutely is hope.
It just feels like a lot of that hope has left. I mean, I know we're talking about it still being there, but when you see the crime rates and you see a lot of the schools closing and you see just that lack of jobs and affordable housing, it seems like there's a mix here.
Right.
How how do you think that how systematic do you think this is?
It's absolutely systemic. And in addition to that, it's not a monolithic problem. You know, all of these systems, we have to work together and get coalitions that are working together to address all of the problems with so many different systems, not just, you know, you could point to housing, but the jobs issue. The reason there, if Chicago has, you know, in certain places a higher amount of crime in certain areas, that goes back to a jobs issue. So all of these things are all interrelated. And I think that in order to create systemic change, in order to, really advance that hope and see a different kind of Chicago, we've got to work on changing policies, and we've got to work on, addressing a myriad of issues all at once instead of, one at a time.
And we have to work on what also we know to be true, that there are jobs that exist, that Chicago is attracting the business community. Our neighborhood, people in the neighborhoods just have to have access to the education. What's happening in Chicago is not happening in a vacuum of just our city. Look at New York, look at DC, look at Philadelphia. The same things have taken place, and we can see the progression of where some of these cities are and can see actually where Chicago is going. What we need is access to information, education, and training for the jobs and the careers that are available.
Those cities that you named have strong black middle classes, and it just seems like the middle class, the black middle class here in Chicago is certainly diminishing when you look at Atlanta or at Washington, D.C., or as you named, New York.
Well, we have to stop allowing ourselves to be exploited. We get exploited by entertainment. I mean, look, people take the perception of crime in Chicago and they come and they make films strictly about crime in Chicago. And we saw this 20 years ago in LA when it was like, look, the Crips and the Bloods, boys in the hood. And, people make money off of other people's pain. And as citizens in a community, we have to tell the whole story. You can't tell a story about street crime in Chicago without talking about economic and political crime in Chicago and corruption and historic corruption in this city. And so we have to stop allowing ourselves to be exploited in the name of fame.
Well, it's really interesting, me having been a youngster, spent a couple of years growing up in Atlanta, the metropolitan area there in Fulton County, and you talk about those rich black middle classes, stable middle classes that have been able to be built in big cities that have some of the same issues that Chicago's faced with. How can we achieve to the level of a place in the South like in Atlanta, which we do see some of our people migrating to for more opportunity?
I think we have to change the narrative. As a storyteller, I'm really concerned about the narrative of this city in general. And I think we have to change the narrative and really demonstrate, to the point that Che was just making, there are so many rich opportunities in this city, and the access and the openness should be for everyone. That message should be clear, and so we were talking about the Oriental Theater Egyptian exhibit just before the segment started. And, that's a powerful piece. And it's a powerful piece of storytelling. We need to make sure that we are providing the access and the opportunities for, for people to get that. I think that changing the narrative is the first step. I think creating opportunities, to go back to the jobs point, there are tons of jobs, but typically what happens is the jobs and the how people are trained don't sync up, because people don't go to college necessarily to for a job. You go to college for education, right? But and then when you think about training, when you think about opportunities to be trained for certain types of jobs, the world is changing very quickly. Technology is moving fast, and how are we engaging with communities of color to make sure that that access continues to be there, so that those jobs can be, impacted?
Love that. Change the narrative.